Today, join me as I'm going to be saving this Amiga from the trash by bringing it back to life with a simple mod. So here you can see a very famous Amiga demo running behind me, loaded from a USB on a newly installed Gotek drive. And today I'm going to be showing you how I did it, not from a kit that I bought online, but from scratch using a bog standard Gotek that I found on AliExpress. But before we start, you might be wondering how I ended up with this Amiga. As I mentioned, it was heading for the trash as apparently it wasn't working. But a family friend said they knew someone who would love it. Yes, that person is me. So I ended up with the non-working Amiga. And after a closer inspection, and especially since I could hear it struggling, I worked out that it was the floppy drive that was broken. So I gave it a bit of a clean and a service and still couldn't get it working. So I thought, you know what, this machine is perfect for a Gotek upgrade. So let's get started. Now I'll just go through the bits that I've bought from AliExpress to do this. So firstly, I've got this 0.91 inch 128 by 32 OLED display module. I've got a KY040 360-degree rotary encoder with a cap, and finally I've got a Gotek drive which has an archery chipset. The first thing that we need to do to get this Gotek working with the Amiga is to change the stock firmware to a compatible one, which is FlashFloppy. But before I do that, I'm just going to check that I've bought the right Gotek with the right chipset, so I'm going to open it up and we can have a look. Okay, so I've just gotten the board out, and I've also got out my digital microscope to help me look at this chip, as it is absolutely tiny. It's probably only about ½ centimeter across, and the letters are quite difficult to see. But if I put it under here and just line it up, I can see that the chip version I've got is a AT32F415. I will say it was a bit of a nightmare actually buying the Gotek drive from AliExpress, because as you can see here, there is a lot of different options, and I found that a lot of the listings don't actually tell you what chip is in there, and also I've got to be careful that I am actually getting the Gotek drive that is pictured. But I found the best way to check is I've just got a listing here, and if I scroll down to the reviews, there is people just saying that it is compatible with the FlashFloppy, and the person here has even written out what chip is in there as well, which is useful. And if you are unsure, then the GitHub for FlashFloppy does have a comprehensive list of all of the compatible chips and drives, and also the ones to avoid. So now that I know what chipset I've got, I can move on to the firmware programming, and I've just pulled the page up here with the instructions for the archery microcontroller that I can follow. And the first thing I need to do is to enter programming mode, and this is done through a boot jumper. As you can see here, it bridges 2 pins. So I've just made a little boot jumper here. I'm just going to follow that photo and put it into those there like that. And then to connect this to my computer, I've got this cable here, which is USB-A to USB-A. And I can just plug that in to the back here. And then when I'm ready, this will plug into the PC. Now I've just got everything ready to start programming. I've plugged the board into the computer, and I've also done some downloads. So I've downloaded the archery drivers and also the programmer as well, and installed them. And the links for all that are on the GitHub. And I've got the programmer open on this side of the screen, and I'm just going to follow through these instructions to flash the firmware. So the first step is to change the language settings, which I can do down here from Chinese to English, which will make it a lot easier. And then it's already set it the port type to USB, which is the one we need, so that's good. Then click next, and there's a few screens I've just got to click through here to get to this one with a lot of options. And the option I need is to disable the access protection. So if I make sure that is clicked on and click next, there we go, it says the flash memory will be erased, which is what we want. So if I click yes, that is running now. The disable access protection successfully. So if I click back, I can now add the FlashFloppy firmware to the Gotek drive. So if I click download to device here, and I've already downloaded the firmware from the GitHub, and I've just put that on the desktop, so I can just click it there and then press next and OK. Okay, so that's finished. It was actually quite quick. It only took 11 seconds, and it says operation finished successfully. So now I can just unplug this, And now the new firmware is on the Gotek drive and ready to use. But before I install the drive into the Amiga, I first need to prepare the connections for the OLED screen and also for the rotary encoder. Now the OLED screen should be pretty simple to install, as it has this header here where the 3-digit LED is currently, and I can just take that one out and put the OLED screen in. On the other hand, the rotary encoder is a bit more tricky as there is no header, although this artery drive does actually have the holes here, but they haven't been soldered over, so I'm going to have to desolder them before I add the header. I've got my desoldering gun heated up, and I've also just added a little bit of fresh solder to these holes as well to hopefully make it a bit easier. And I'm going to desolder this and I'll be back when it's done. Right, so now those holes are cleared, I can get to actually soldering the header. So I've got my box of headers here and I've just cut one down to the right size. And a good tip I've learned for actually attaching these is to use a breadboard to hold them into place. The pins on these headers tend to move around all over the place, so using a breadboard just keeps them nice and in line. So I have prepared that here, and I've also added a bit of flux and another breadboard on the other side to help balance it as well. So I can just start soldering. I'm going to start with the opposing corners to make sure that it's held into place. So if I start on this leg, and then just to make sure that's flush, I'll just push it down, and I can do the other side like that, and then just the rest of those pins. Now that I've prepared the board, the next step is to 3D print some parts to help install it into the Amiga. I need an internal bracket to mount the Gotek board where the floppy drive currently is, and I also need an external enclosure for the OLED screen and the encoder. So for the internal bracket, I found this model by CrazyBob on Thingiverse called the Amiga A500 Gotek USB bracket. However, for the external enclosure, I haven't managed to find a pre-designed model that works with the rotary encoder that I've bought. So whilst the bracket is printing, I'm going to have a go at designing one myself, and I'll see you when that's done. Okay, so while that bracket was printing, I've just designed in Fusion 360 the enclosure, and it has a window on this side for the screen and then a hole here for the rotary encoder, and then underneath there's a bracket as well to hold the screen into place. And if I minimize this screen, you can see here I've already exported that as an STL and dragged it into preset slicer. So I'm just going to get this sliced and printed on the preset, and once again I'll see you when that's done. So those two parts are now printed. I've got CrazyBob's bracket, and I will leave a link to the Thingiverse page with this on in the description. And I've also got the enclosure that I designed in Fusion 360. And for those that are interested, I will upload the files for this on my printables page, and I'll leave a link to that in the description as well. But now that I've done that, it is finally time to get on to actually installing it into the Amiga. Of course, before I actually install this, I've first got to open up the Amiga to get to the floppy drive, which is what I'm going to do now. Okay, so I've just attached the Gotek board to CrazyBob's bracket, and I'll just go through the process that I used to do that now. So the first thing I used was my tap set that I've got here to thread the holes in the plastic, which will make life a lot easier. Two of those holes were for the spacers that you can see up here, and I've just used the original spacers from the floppy drive from here and here, and the other holes are for when I screw this into the Amiga. And if I just flip this over, you can see I've just raided my supplies for 3 M3 self-tapping screws. They're here, here, and here to attach the board to the bracket. So I've just installed the bracket using the 3 original screws here, here, and here. And then if I turn it over, I've had to use another screw here, which I also took from the floppy drive. Next, I've just put back on the RF shield, reattached the keyboard and also reattached the floppy cable and the power cable. And I'm gonna wire up the OLED screen and also the rotary encoder so we can give it a bit of a test before I put it all back together. So I'm gonna start with the OLED screen and I'll just flash on the left side of the screen the wiring diagram for this so you can see it, but this will just attach onto that header here. And then I'll wire up the rotary encoder, and once again I'll flash up the diagram for this, and this is going to attach on that header that I soldered on earlier. And an important step I need to do to get this to work is to take the jumpers from the default settings. So I'm going to remove this one completely, and then this one is going to move from S1 position that it's in over to the S0 position there. And then I'm also just going to bend this LED over to the right to stop it getting in the way of the case. I'm back from wiring everything up, and I'm pleased to say, as you can probably see from the very famous demo running behind me, that it all works great. I downloaded an ADF floppy disk image, copied it to a pen stick, put it in the Gotek, and it all loaded without any issues. I'm also pleased to share how well this enclosure that I designed and printed holds all the parts into place. So if I flip it over, you can see the rotary encoder on this side, which doesn't budge at all. And then also the screen over here with that bracket that I printed. I've gone and found some tiny M2 self-tapping screws to secure that as well. And then now I'm moving on to the difficult part, which is going to be threading these cables through the case. And to do that, I'm going to cut them near the connector end on this side, thread them through, and then recrimp them on the other side. And I'll see you when that's done. Okay, so I'm finally finished. I've put the Amiga all back together, and I've also just given it another little test, and it's all working great, as you can see. Although this process did take longer than I thought it would initially, mainly because DuPont crimping is just a really fiddly process. Not one of my favorite activities, but definitely something that I do need to get a bit more practice on. But I got there in the end, and you can see the enclosure is sitting nicely on here. I designed it so that it would fit into these grooves, and it doesn't move around at all. Another thing I'm really pleased about is the colour match on this filament. I'm using the eSun bone white filament, and I was actually really shocked just how good this is compared to the Amiga. If I put it on there, you can see that it is pretty much a spot-on colour match. And if you're wondering how the Gotek drive works, I've just copied some ADF Amiga floppy disk images to this USB, and if I pop it in at the side here, I can use my rotary encoder to select the file that I want, press down, and it will start loading. And it's as easy as that. Now that I've gone through the whole process and put everything back together, there are a couple of things that I would have done differently. Firstly, when I soldered that header on earlier, I just used a straight header. However, it would have been better to use a right-angled header, as I found that when I was putting it back together with the DuPont connectors, the header was too tall and I had to bend the pins back to actually get the top of the Amiga case on. Secondly, I also, rather than threading the cables through the grooves in the top of the Amiga, it would have been better to just take them out the side here and then put a hole in the side of the enclosure for them to go through. Firstly, as it would have simplified the process quite a bit, and also it would have made the enclosure movable. So there we go, an Amiga brought back to life with a somewhat simple upgrade. As I mentioned before, I will leave links in the description to all of the resources that I've used today, and I'll also upload the 3D printer files and the wiring diagrams for the enclosure that I designed on my printables page, and I'll leave a link to that as well. I'd love for you to let me know other mods that I should check out for the Amiga, and also what games that you recommend that I try. Speaking of which, whenever I usually post about the Amiga, I get loads of people asking me if I've ever tried the game The Great Giana Sisters, which is what I'm going to try now in the outro. But that's all for today. I'll see you next time.